benchmarking, the benchmarking and energy efficiency carousel, getting to BEPS. BEPS is the city's building energy performance standard. And we're really here to talk about planning for better, healthier, and more efficient buildings, because our buildings, how we build them and how we design them and how we operate them and how we live in them, have a big impact on the environment. This also, though, means that buildings provide a huge opportunity. That they can be heroes in our fight against wasted energy, air pollution, and climate change. And I love this slide because it shows how cost-effective emission reductions from buildings can be. So we have a really great lineup this morning. We have some good presentations. I'm going to introduce each of our presenters separately before they speak, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions after each of them. You can also put your questions in the chat, or when the time comes, if you'd like to raise your hand. I'll just say that we do have a lot of content to cover, so we'll do our best to get to all the questions. And my colleague Freddie Brandt is on this this meeting, and she's going to be helping with the chat and stuff too. So if you see her or chiming in, that's why. So our first presenter is Rajiv Ravulapati. Rajiv is the Government Services Analyst with the City of St. Louis's Building Division, and he oversees all the benchmarking and building energy performance standard work. He's worked on energy issues for his entire career, so I'm going to let him take it away.
Thanks, Emily. Morning, everybody, and thanks so much for attending today's carousel. So as Emily mentioned, my name is Rajiv Ravulapati. I'm an analyst for the building division for the City of St. Louis, and I'm going to be giving an overview of the ordinance that was passed back in April of 2020. So you can go on to the next slide, Emily. So what I'm going to discuss today is at a very high level what the ordinance is, the details of the ordinance, some of the policy components and elements. I'm going to talk about why the city looked to pass this ordinance since we've been building upon benchmarking, which the city has had since 2017. I'm going to talk a bit about the Building Energy Improvement Board, which is one of the unique points of our legislation, unique to this kind of policy overall. St. Louis is just one of 4 jurisdictions right now in the country that has some type of BPS, building performance standard policy, but it's a continuing trend that we see across the country. And excuse me for that typo there. I'm also going to give a review of the BEPS targets because they're no longer draft. The Building and Energy Improvement Board has approved them, and the city has published them back in early May. So you can go on to the next one, Emily. Okay, I'm just going to minimize my screen. Okay, so what BEPS is, again, it's an acronym for Building Energy Performance Standards. So what the law actually is it's creating minimum energy performance standards, legal requirements for building owners to ensure that their buildings meet that minimum level of energy performance, hence why it is the standard. The reason for this is back in 2017, that's when the city passed its benchmarking ordinance. So the benchmarking ordinance, that benchmarking data, that local benchmarking data that is annually reported, that is the foundational data that supports the creation of the standards and one of the foundational pieces of this ordinance. Additionally, when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions being emitted from the city of St. Louis, you'll see, according to our latest greenhouse gas inventory back in 2018, buildings are the largest sector responsible for greenhouse gases. When you combine our industrial, commercial, and residential buildings, it accounts for nearly 80%. When it's just looking at commercial and residential buildings, it's about 65% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from those 2 sectors. So this legislation is meant to take aim at improving our own building stock, incorporating better energy efficiency into our buildings because of the amount of pollution we have in our city. Now, the city has a greenhouse gas reduction goal that was instituted under the previous administration, under the Cruzen administration. It's a non-binding resolution, but it is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 100% by 2050 from 2005 levels. So this legislation is part of the city's overall climate protection initiative and our decarbonization strategy, but it's also meant to be aggressive because of the urgency of climate change and for the urgency in trying to maintain our own building stock. You can go to the next one, Emily. So this map right here shows different jurisdictions and cities around the country that have some type of benchmarking and transparency policy, or currently have policies where there are requirements of achieving performance targets. And right now, St. Louis is one of four, like I mentioned. St. Louis, New York City, DC, and Washington State are the four jurisdictions that have some type of BPS policy. You can move on to the next one, Emily. So to talk a little bit about the process, many of you who are on the call today were part of a stakeholder group that the city's had since benchmarking began. It's something we call our Benchmarking Implementation Advisory Group. We spent, now this timeline that you see here is covering from July to spring 2020. But we spent almost a year and a half developing the policy with our local stakeholders. We would hold these bi-monthly meetings at various locations around the city and met with various groups such as BOMA, the Housing Authority, various trade groups, real estate agents, commercial building owners, all the trades groups, everyone who would be affected by this ordinance. So we spent a good time trying to figure out and hear from the community what would be the next iteration of benchmarking. Initially, the city thought about doing some type of audit or retrocommissioning policy, but it was actually from the stakeholders that we heard of moving more aggressively away from that kind of policy and doing something that mandated minimum standards for our buildings so we can actually trigger faster investment and measures into the buildings because of just how far apart our buildings are lagging between their national counterparts, which I'll talk a little bit more later on. You can go to the next one, Emily. So, you know, I do want to recognize the city for its achievement on particularly this performance standard, but also because if many of you if you're familiar with ACEEE, the American Council on an Energy Efficient Economy, they issue city and state clean energy scorecards every year. And for St. Louis, back in 2019, it was rated the 36th most energy efficient city in the country, and we were able to jump up 8 spots. The building performance standard is definitely a factor in helping the city achieve a better ranking when it comes to its efficiency status. But the city has also passed a solar readiness ordinance. We've signed a green tariff MOU under the previous administration with Ameren. The city now also has an EV ready ordinance. So there has been a lot of progressive building policy and clean energy policy happening in the city of St. Louis in the past 4 years. You can go to the next one, Emily. Okay, so the actual policy elements themselves. So what is the standard? So each jurisdiction has a different performance metric that they use. Here in St. Louis, what we decided to go with is weather normalized site energy use intensity. So the amount of energy that's used on site at the building level. A couple different reasons why we wanted to do this is because we think this metric, for one, is more conducive towards building electrification, which is a growing trend that you typically are right now seeing on the coasts, but has been slowly gaining more traction from the coast inward into the country. We wanted to give building owners flexibility about the energy they actually use, whereas with source energy use intensity, while that does take into account the energy used on site, it also takes into the total picture of the transmission, the distribution, the line losses, and we didn't want to penalize building owners for things that were out of their control. And this metric also allows for greater flexibility for building owners to choose whatever measures that they deem fit in order to help reach their respective standard by property type. So like I said earlier, our standards are aggressive. The ordinance calls for that the standards have to be set at or below the 35th percentile of that site EUI median data. And the reason we do that, so the standards are calculated so at least 65% of our buildings have to improve their energy and performance. Now you may ask yourself, that is a large swath of buildings that have to comply. We've got a little over 1,000 buildings that will have to comply with both benchmarking and BEPS. And when you actually look at that data comparison of looking at national 35% percentile data and are using local benchmarking data and looking at the local 35th percentile data, you'll see that our buildings are lagging far behind from their national counterparts, hence why we wanted to pursue an aggressive policy. But I'll talk a little bit more about the compliance pathways. The standards have been finalized, and the buildings that have to comply with this are similar to benchmarking: all commercial, institutional, multifamily, and municipal buildings that are 50,000 square feet and above. So how will compliance be measured and tracked? So similar to benchmarking, building owners will be able to monitor their progress during each compliance period through Portfolio Manager. That's the mandated tool used for benchmarking, and that'll be the mandated tool to document compliance with this ordinance as well. One distinguishing piece is with benchmarking, before I was hired by the city and before the benchmarking and before I was even involved with the benchmarking legislation, data verification was not required when you report your benchmarking data. There will be data verification points with this policy, and currently we're refining them right now through the city's rulemaking process, and we'll be issuing guidance about those later this summer. So the timeline for BEPS is most buildings will have 4 years to meet the standard, so by 2025. During our stakeholder meetings and looking at the actual benchmarking data that the city's collected year after year since 2017, we've noticed that particularly two property types, affordable housing, qualified affordable housing, and houses of worship, typically have the toughest time with just having the tools and staff to report benchmarking data, but also beyond that, just actually having the knowledge to implement some of the measures that are necessary for them to be more energy efficient. So hence why we gave these two property types six years to meet their respective standard. It's something we heard from affordable housing advocates, and it's something we've heard from also national partners like the National Housing Trust, as well as some local partners that we've worked with here to incorporate their feedback. So like I said, for most buildings will have 4 years, and qualified affordable housing and houses of worship will have 6 years to meet the respective standard. And after each cycle, so after 2025, there'll be a gap year where the city will look at local benchmarking data again and reevaluate if the standards need to change. You can go to the next one, Emily. So in terms of the compliance pathways, we are currently in the rulemaking process right now on defining these compliance pathways a bit further, something we'll also provide more guidance on later this summer. But at a high level, what we're thinking about right now are 4 different pathways. So the first one is what we just simply call the performance pathway. If your building's already currently meeting the standard or stays consistent with their respective standard during the compliance cycle, they're considered compliant, and the building owner does not have to do anything. So as long as they maintain that level of performance. If you can't do the performance pathway, if you believe you can't reach that, then we are working on a different pathway to incentivize early adopters, to incentivize them to start investing now for longer term compliance, where if a building can do a certain set of measures that will allow them to be in compliance for multiple compliance cycles. Right now, the working title we have for this compliance pathway is called Rewarding Early Adopters. And again, that will be fleshed out more to come this summer. There is there are 2 other pathways which fall underneath the umbrella of what we call alternative compliance pathways. So what you see on the slide here is there's a concept that we've been working on called narrowing the gap between your current performance and the performance standard for the property, where we're looking at, let's say, I'm going to use an arbitrary number. If your office building has a site EUI of 100 and the performance standard is 50, and I'm not saying it is 50, I just don't recall it off the top of my head. what narrowing the gap means is we would want you to reduce your energy load by 50% to narrow that gap. And if you are able to do that within a compliance cycle, the building division will treat you as compliant and give you some options for that. The other option for underneath alternative compliance plans is if you can't meet performance standard, if you can't meet the performance pathway, if you can't meet narrow the gap, if you can't do be an early adopter that allows you to be in compliance for multiple cycles, then the other option is coming up with your own custom ACP, where it's on the onus is on you as the building owner to go through an ASHRAE level 2 audit and work with our building energy improvement board to make an agreement on what measures must be done within a compliance period to be considered compliant. And the very last resort is if you can't do any of those, this ordinance does have penalties associated with it. So there would be an alternative compliance payment, and each day you're past that deadline, it will be treated as a separate offense. So fines can rack up, and we'll be also using the building code to help enforce this ordinance, where there may be discussion of withholding of certain building permits, but that is the very last resort. And we're trying to refine these custom pathways as much as we can, so we can try and encourage participation and compliance as best we can. So you can go to the next one, Emily, and I'll try and ramp up the last few slides I have. So this slide covers the Building Energy Improvement Board. This is a 9-member board appointed by the mayor. This board is responsible for a couple things. They're responsible for recommending and establishing and approving the standards by property type, which is what we spent the first quarter of this year doing. They are going to review alternative compliance plans submitted by building owners. Any custom pathways that they find is helpful for other property types, we will use that as a template and provide it to building owners through a special BEPS portal that we're building out right now. And they can also establish a technical subcommittee. So within our ordinance, it also called for the Office of Building Performance. This is a new office that will oversee both benchmarking and BEPS. These two entities, our new office and the Building Energy Improvement Board, if for some reason between our two entities, we feel like there is still not enough technical expertise to make a judgment on an ACP, on an alternative compliance plan, the board or the office can establish a technical subcommittee to use experts, to hire local experts to help weigh in on that decision-making process on custom ACP plans. So this board will be designed to really work with building owners on helping meet the standard or looking at different options. You can go to the next one, Emily. So I won't spend too much time on here, but there is, I'm happy to share the city's webpage on the actual targets themselves and our methodology, but this is an infographic by property type that shows on the left the property type group, the target itself, the BEPS right there, and the distribution of those site EUI values relative to BEPS. Initially, when we looked at benchmarking data, we had 44 reported property types, and then we created what we call BEPS super categories. And that's what you see on the left-hand side. There's a little over 20 BEPS property type super categories where we've lumped some buildings into their own property type. So these are the property types that various buildings will be assigned to, and what the actual target is for each property type. And that blue line in the middle is the actual BEPS target right there. And you can see, for example, for schools and offices and multifamily, that there's a lot of buildings that are really close to that standard, but are going to still need some help on meeting that standard. And then there are some buildings, like if you look for like laboratories, that are really far apart, which may not be able to meet the standard, hence why we're working on these different compliance pathways to make it easier for building owners. You can go to the next one, Emily. So in terms of next steps, like I said, the building division is continuing its rulemaking process right now. We plan on releasing a guidance document later this year. So the implementation of the ordinance will not begin just yet until we finish the rulemaking process and we have the fleshed out compliance pathways, and we'll be able to share some draft versions with our local stakeholder community to get feedback on. Implementation will not start until late this fall, until we get that guidance document out, finalize our rules on data verification and the compliance pathways. So that kind of covers those 2 bullet points, the second and third one. And one of the most exciting things happening with a lot of the building efficiency work in the past couple of years is the USGBC will be spearheading an initiative to launch a local building energy exchange this year. Think of it as a one-stop shop hub for building owners to learn everything that they can about making their building more energy efficient, as well as learning opportunities to adopt clean energy solutions. So one of the primary functions for this exchange will be to support building owners that have to comply with BEPS. And if you have more questions about the exchange itself, I would defer to the USGBC on those questions. But the city and our new office will work in conjunction with this exchange in order to work with building owners complying with BEPS. So, what building owners can start doing right now is, if you've got questions for the city, please send them our way. But what you can start doing right now is, double checking your benchmarking data, beginning to create an internal team to start planning and doing implementation strategies, developing a strategic energy management plan. So these are just some quick high level ones, but for more questions, you can always reach out to the city. This is just an example of a building energy scorecard that the building division uses to send out to folks who have to comply. This gives them a sense of how their building has been performing since benchmarking began and gives them an idea of how close they are to the actual standard. You can go to the next one, Emily. And just to wrap up, so there will be a lot more educational opportunities for both benchmarking and BEPS, and training opportunities for building staff to become more sustainable and green-minded when they're actually doing their operations and maintenance. These opportunities are listed on the USGBC's website as well as the city's website. And I think this is the last slide I've got, so I'm happy to take questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Rajiv. We do have a couple questions in the chat, and I'll just read one of them I answered, but the one from James is, how are mixed use buildings handled, as a single property type or a blended type?
That's a good question, James. So, and I'm happy to follow up further offline about this, but what we did is, so we worked with an analyst at WashU, and when we looked at mixed use buildings, it is a single property type. So we looked at the square footage, the square footage that was largely used, we assigned them that property type. So it will be used as a single property type.
Great, thank you. And this is, just to clarify, that's a similar method that Energy Star Portfolio Manager uses. So following that tools logic, right?
Correct. Yeah, we worked with the EPA, specifically their Energy Star team, as Emily mentioned, in getting that national percentile data to compare to our local data, because there's only 3 property types that actually use national benchmarks for the standards, versus every other property type uses local standards using our local benchmarking data and local 35th percentile values.
Great. Another question in the chat from Matt Emden. If a building moves to the option of an ASHRAE level 2 audit, is there a standard as to which measures must be implemented, meaning the measures that have a payback of 5 years or less, or is there some way that there'll be guidance around that?
That's a great question. As of right now, no, but it is up for discussion with the board. So the board meets pretty regularly. Right now they're meeting on a bi-weekly basis in the summertime. They're public meetings, so people from the public can join those meetings. But right now, I don't have an exact answer to that, Matt, but it is something that could be taken into consideration for minimum standard for what you're talking about.
Great. One more question. Anybody have a question? Can unmute if you want to.
I have another quick question.
Matt has all the questions. Yeah, go for it.
one of the things I noticed in the and maybe this changed, but for like churches and public gathering, is that still combined with like nightclubs?
So houses of worship are their own.
Okay.
They have their own target.
Okay, I think at one point they were, but I think that must have been a correction that we made.
So
maybe not.
The two biggest changes that came. So the city held a 30-day comment period when we released our draft targets. And just so I'm making sure I'm not misquoting myself, is so the two biggest changes that came out of that 30-day comment period that informed these finalized standards for the board are we ended up using here we go. So originally underneath the public assembly super category, museums and libraries were lumped into that. We removed them from the public assembly super categories into their own individual property types. So museums and libraries have their own separate targets. The second change that came from that comment period is national 35th percentile values were assigned to the following property types: food service, libraries, and refrigerated warehouses. So when we were going through the analysis, if we had a property type where we had less than 10 buildings data to inform the standard, we went with national data because we just didn't have enough of those reported buildings through benchmarking for that property type to use a local standard. Hence why we used national data shared with us by portfolio manager. Every other property type is using local standards based on local benchmarking data. So those were the two biggest changes. And I'll make sure to drop into the chat, Emily, a link to the city's page about the standards where you can access them and read a bit more about the methodology for grouping the property types and for the standards themselves.
Hey, Emily, Paul Merrill, I had a real quick question, and I apologize. I was popping in and out. If you covered this already, please stop me. But Rajiv, thanks a lot. You're doing a great job. You know, here in an area of the country where we're the show me state, you know, we're actually doing the tell everybody how to do this. Not a technical question at all, but what kind of accolades are you getting from around the country? What kind of feedback? What kind of people seeking out information on how you're doing it? Because I think this is fantastic, and it makes me really proud of what you and others are doing. Can you share any of that?
In terms of like recognition and accolades, well, I mean, for one, you know, I mentioned earlier that the American Council on an Energy Efficient Economy, they do annual city clean energy scorecards. In 2019, the city ranked 36 out of 100. In 2020, we bumped up to 8 spots, so 28 out of 100. A large part due to BEPS, but I don't want to just solely give the credit to BEPS. The city also has passed a solar readiness ordinance in 2019. We passed BEPS last year. We passed an EV readiness ordinance. So that's definitely one piece of recognition. And then in terms of accolades, I wouldn't say there's been any new, there have not been like awards or anything given to the city about that. But what we're doing currently here in St. Louis, especially with the creation of this Building Energy Improvement Board, is being considered as a model for other jurisdictions who are drafting up this legislation. So right now, what I can share is I know there are 23 jurisdictions right now looking at some type of BPS policy around the country, with a likelihood of at least 10 or 11 looking to actually become legislation by 2023. Boston has one, Chicago is developing one this year, and a few smaller cities. But this trend of BPS policies is going to be a new standard for buildings around the country.
Now, Emily, I'll speak to that point.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Please put any more questions for Rajiv in the chat. We have to move on to the next presentation. I hate to cut that short, but we've got a lot of content. So up next is Cady Seabaugh, who is the Vice President of Sustainability with McCormack, Baron Salazar. She's been advocating for sustainable, affordable housing there for 15 years. Cady, will you take it away? And I'll just ask Rajiv to reply to the other BEPS question that James had in the chat.
I'll
Take it
try to
away,
not
Cady.
get distracted from the chat. So tell me, Emily, if there's a question in the chat for me.
Sure.
So good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about McCormack Barron and what we are doing in St. Louis regarding our affordable housing portfolio. And Emily, if you go to the next slide. So McCormack Barron, I'm sure most of you are familiar with us. We are a national affordable housing developer. We are headquartered in downtown St. Louis. We've been around for just about 50 years. And a result of that is these are all of our, I'm just checking quickly, developments. It doesn't look like they're currently on, but these are all of the developments we've done in St. Louis in the relatively recent past. I think it's the past 20 years. And on the next slide, these are the buildings we still own that fall under the Building Energy Performance Standard. So we are looking in St. Louis at this particular portfolio of buildings and grappling with what we have to worry about in the next 6 years. All of these are affordable housing under the low-income housing tax credit program. So next slide. So the challenges that we have, particularly in buildings, multifamily housing buildings under LIHTC, although some of these apply also to other multifamily housing buildings, is during the tax credit compliance period, we can't bring on additional debt. Because we're under the LIHTC program, we can't raise rents. If we do anything to the building at all, we have to get LIHTC investor approvals. There's a typo in LIHTC. Sorry about that. We have to get LIHTC investor approvals, which requires bringing in our counsel and their counsel. We have to get other investor and lender approvals as we change anything in the buildings. We have a couple of buildings like this one in Soulard, which is Allen Market Lane, which also has historic considerations that we have to keep in mind. And finally, we have this challenge of split incentives, which is in most of our buildings, residents are paying for their electric utilities. In many of our properties, we're paying for the water, but residents are paying for the electric. And the result is the idea of the benefits go to the residents' bills, but because of LIHTC requirements, because of the way we've structured the building, we can't raise rents. So they're getting the benefit of the energy improvements, but we're not getting the benefit of the payback from those energy improvements. Those are accruing directly to residents. So with all of this in mind, we're looking at the debt. We've been looking at our entire portfolio. And Emily, if you want to go to the next slide. So 6 North is kind of a typical one within our portfolio in St. Louis, 6 North at Laclede and Sarah. It was built in 2003. It is currently out of compliance and we haven't refinanced it yet. So we're kind of at a nice sweet spot right now because we can think about our refinance. We can think about capital improvements and renovations when we're doing that refinance to make sure that, sorry, my headset just went out. All right, can you guys still hear me?
We can hear you, Cady.
Okay. My headset keeps flashing. So good. I'm glad you guys can still hear me. So this is in a nice sweet spot in terms of we are at the end of our compliance period and we can actually make investments into the property. The population in this particular building is a little unique because it has universal design. It was the first universally designed building in St. Louis. So, so there's some inefficiencies in terms of the layout. Sorry, I'm totally distracted because I keep flickering in and out. So let me know if you, for some reason, stop hearing me. And it's also a mixed use building and we don't have 6 North on the ground floor now. We've got a brew pub on the ground floor, but working with our commercial tenants as well as our residential tenants. So the things we're looking at for 6 North are, what does that refi look like? how can we change tenant and resident behavior, and how much improvement do we need? So where is our starting point, and how much improvement are we going to need with this building? Our hope is that it's not going to be a whole lot, but we're diving into that now. So next slide. So McCormack House at Forest Park Southeast is also one of these that's out of compliance, and we're currently looking at our refinance and recapitalization on it. It was built in 2001, and it would be much more of a concern because it's probably not built as well as 6 North, or didn't have as much consideration as 6 North. But through Ameren, we've done a bunch of interior retrofits. So we've used the Ameren program. I think all of the refrigerators have been replaced. A lot of the lighting has been replaced. We have occupancy sensors on in the public rooms. And so a lot of what we can do in the interior has been done. So it'll be an interesting case study to see how it's performing today, to know what improvements we can get just by doing those interior retrofits and kind of the easy wins that have programs that can be supported through other financing that's not just our traditional LIHTC financing. The other important consideration here is it's a low-income senior building, but does not qualify as a senior care facility. So this is in the multifamily property portfolio. It is not in the senior care portfolio. At the same time, its population is seniors who tend to be home all day. So all of our residents are using energy all day. We don't get the benefit of residents leaving the building and going out into the world, and thus not using energy during the day as we can on our family properties. So a big consideration in this building is going to be that resident training. How can we train residents to be more energy efficient in their day-to-day activities? Next slide. So the opposite of Mac Park is senior living at Cambridge Heights. And the difference between the two is there's only 8 years difference between when they were built. But senior living at Cambridge Heights was built with Energy Star for Homes. So it was Energy Star certified when it was completed in 2009. It's version 2, not version 3. But we're hoping that that gives us a much better envelope and a much better starting point for Cambridge Heights. And again, Cambridge Heights, this falls under multifamily. It doesn't fall under senior care. So we do have that challenge of residents being home most of the day and using energy throughout the day. And finally, Washington Apartments is one of the buildings that will concern us. It's coming out of compliance in the next couple of years. It's a historic building. The population is mostly seniors, but it's not designated as a senior building. It's not a senior care facility. And it's not right now, it doesn't fall under the BEPS ordinance, but if it ever does, like Allen Market Lane, which was that first slide, which does fall under the BEPS ordinance, we're really focusing on with these historic buildings. What are the things we can do that we can afford, that we can finance, that can improve their efficiency? Because again, this is a senior population, they're home all day, and it's also it was built in 1902. And what are the things that we can do, given also that it was financed under historic tax credits, and we need to preserve the historic nature of the building. So this and Allen Market Lane are my two big red flags of concern, and how can we, what are the things we can, what is the plan we can have for this building? The good news with both of them is we're not in tax credit compliance. And what's really interesting, or we will be, in this case, we will be coming out of tax credit compliance next year. In looking at our portfolio of what falls under BEPS, our entire BEPS portfolio right now, we're lucky, is coming out of compliance in the next few years. So we will have an opportunity to refinance them. I was very concerned that we would have something that wasn't going to fall, wasn't going to come out of the tax credit compliance period for another 10 years and struggling with, you know, what is our alternative compliance path for those buildings if we can't put any additional financing in them. So that's what we're thinking about. That's the approach that we are taking. We're working with asset management, property management, Urban Strategies is a nonprofit we work with to engage residents. We're working with them to develop a resident engagement program. And we're obviously working with our investors and our lenders to just keep them aware of what's going on. Any questions?
Cady, I did
question
just,
about, have we checked the EUI of Washington apartments? I tried to pull the data because I wanted it for this presentation, and our consultants didn't get back to me. But I will happily, as soon as I get it, share it with you.
I did just want to clarify, when you're talking about buildings coming out of compliance, it's with the low-income housing tax credits, correct?
Right.
Okay.
It's whether we're in the compliance period where we can't put any additional debt on the building and we can't do any real capital improvements.
As opposed to compliance with the ordinance, with the building performance standards. So just
correct.
to make sure people understand that.
Yeah.
Cady, have you guys ever taken advantage of like the federal low-income energy tax incentives or energy improvement incentives, like the LEAP program, where essentially you get every resident in one of your low-income facilities, you apply on their behalf, and then that bucket of money gets to be used to make improvements on the entire facility? Is that an opportunity you guys have ever looked at?
I don't know that we've ever looked at it.
And I don't know the status of those programs. It's been a few years since I did a project like that, but I have done that on a larger multifamily low-income senior facility, and essentially it's, you know, because it's more geared towards like an individual program. It's, you know, weatherization funding is essentially what it is. But when in a multifamily project, you can consolidate that money and then be able to capitalize some of those bigger projects.
Yeah. And I do know that some of the programs, at least the local weatherization programs, if you were LIHTC financed, you were excluded from benefit.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I don't know, but I'll look into it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Cady?
Cady, do you know off the top of your head, what is the total number of buildings in your portfolio that will be subject to BEPS?
If we go back to that slide.
I just missed that one.
Yeah, well, and you can't really tell from that slide the way it's also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Thanks, Emily.
Yep. Other questions?
I have a quick question, curiosity. Has the BEPS standard changed your approach and how you'll build buildings in the future? Are there other considerations like not building in the city or building so that they comply, you know, obviously with the BEPS standard?
It has not, but it is interesting. We haven't done any large senior buildings, or our senior buildings tend to be the ones that are under BEPS, because our multifamily buildings tend to be, you know, 6 and 8 unit buildings. We haven't done any large buildings like that since Cambridge Heights. So we haven't had anything that would fall under the program since 2009, but I don't think we were doing it because of BEPS. It probably would change a little bit how we design our building systems. If we did a large building like that, we would we might reconsider reconsider the way we design our building systems. although right now we're going down for senior buildings, we tend to be using mini splits anyway. We've converted over to mini splits, which should which should help considerably. The envelope improvements plus the mini splits being the biggest energy hogs in the building. But we generally meet Energy Star V3 and everything we're building everywhere in the country, which again should help.
Well, Cady, thank you so much for your presentation, and look forward to seeing how everything plays out for your portfolio as we move forward. I'm sure there'll be some good case studies there. So we're going to move on to our next presenter, Jonathon Bell. Jonathon's an energy engineer with Ross and Baruzzini, where he's been for a little over 2 years. So I'm going to let him take it away. He's going to talk about using energy audits and retrocommissioning as a planning tool for preparing for compliance.
Yep, thanks, Emily. So you can go ahead in the next slide. All right, so I'm gonna copy off Rajiv a little bit. I've got this one in my presentation too. By now, hopefully, if you haven't already seen this, or hopefully you've seen this before this presentation, if not, you're seeing it now, but hopefully you have some kind of idea where you lie at on this chart. If you're to the left, great job keeping your building efficient. If you're on the right, hopefully you're starting to plan on how to get your EUI of your building to meet your BEPS target. Go ahead to the next slide. So today I'm going to be talking about retrocommissioning studies versus energy audits, what the difference between those is, why starting with energy efficiency is important, what investing in efficiency can do for your building, different types or levels of energy audits. I'll briefly touch on financing for energy audits and associated energy conservation measures. And then I'll show a couple of our service offerings that we have at Ross and Baruzzini. Okay. So you're probably familiar with retrocommissioning and energy audits. You've probably heard those terms used before. You might also have a little bit of confusion as to what the difference is. I know I was there when I first started in this industry, and it took me a while to really understand the true difference between the two. So to illustrate that, I'm going to talk about the definition of each of these and then move on to some typical measures that you might see in each study. So a retrocommissioning study is one that's focused on allowing your building to return to normal operation, normal being as it was originally designed to operate. An energy audit, meanwhile, is going to be focused on saving you energy or saving you money or just all around promoting efficiency in your building. So in this graphic to the right here, I've got some typical measures that you might see in a retrocommissioning study or energy conservation energy audit. The measures in each of those, we abbreviate them to RCXMs and ECMs typically in the industry. So on the retrocommissioning side, we might recalculate the loads in the building. It's pretty typical that after maybe 10 years or more, the space uses might have changed. Windows might have been upgraded at some point or films applied. So that'll affect the heat loads. So we'd want to recalculate those. We'll review the control sequences that affect the mechanical systems in the building. We'll check some of the physical systems like fan belts, filters on air handlers, things like that. And another example is we can check the sensors and actuators in the building, make sure those are still accurate and they're performing the way they should. During an energy audit, typical conservation measures, this one's really common, updating the lighting in the building, maybe even throwing some lighting controls at that. Demand control ventilation, not bringing in more ventilation air than what you need, which would incur an energy penalty on your building. Converting fans, pumps to variable speed to reduce their power there. And then smart thermostats, I'm kind of using that as a blanket statement to cover anything that is either learning or simply just programmable through the BAS or at the thermostat itself. So you'll notice that a lot of retrocommissioning, there's a lot of overlap between these two. Some retrocommissioning measures will probably save you money. Some energy conservation measures might improve the operation in your building. These two are closely linked, and for me, that was always the source of the confusion. Really, at the end of the day, the reason that they are so closely related is that if you're not operating your building the way it was designed, you're usually going to incur some type of energy penalty because of that. So both of these can be used to get your EUI down. Typically, a better way to do that might be to do an energy focused study if you're wanting to reduce EUI. Next slide, please. All right, so what does an energy audit look like? I know this slide looks really busy. I'll just draw your attention to a couple things. This is our project approach that we use with Ross and Baruzzini. It's pretty typical across the industry. A lot of people will follow some type of schedule like this, but I'll draw your attention to the red figures on the screen. Those represent times where we like to meet with the client just so that we can stay on track, keep them in the loop. And anytime we can get feedback from the client on a project like this, that's good. So to the left, we've got the dark gray arrows. Those represent the different phases of the project, and the light gray arrows to the right just kind of tell what's included. I'm not going to go through everything in the light gray. That would take too long, but as an overview, we start the project with a kickoff meeting, sit down with the client. We like to meet with the building operators, the stakeholders, and just discuss the goals of what the project is. Typically at this meeting, we'll also obtain some pretty key documents like as-built, building trends, utility data, things like that. After this kickoff meeting, we'll start the utility analysis. This is where we look at the utility data and we perform different, we have different analysis strategies that can help us see what your building is doing and how it's reacting to things like the weather or like the equipment in your building, things like that. We move right into the benchmarking phase. You guys are hopefully familiar with these two metrics, EUI, which is Energy Use Index, and ECI, Energy Cost Index. These are really important because they help us to compare different buildings to others in the same climate region with the same use type. After we have this done, we'll sit down with the client, validate our findings, and then we can move on to the later portion of the energy study. So a good thing to note is that if you've been logging your data in Portfolio Manager as part of this program, you're pretty much already done with the utility analysis and benchmarking portions. So that's, guys are ahead. So after we validate those findings, move on to the site investigation. We just like to get into the building, look at all the major energy consuming equipment, and maybe look at the building automation system either remotely or on site. After we do that, we'll develop a list of ECMs, run these by the client, and after we get their approval, we can begin calculating, getting cost opinions, evaluating what rebates are available, and doing a financial analysis of each. So that typically ends the energy audit. We'll end that with a report and send it to the client. Excuse me. After they get the report, review it, we'll start the implementation phase. So the client reviews the report, prioritizes what ECMs they want to implement, and from there we can create bidding documents, go ahead and apply for those rebates that we've found if there are any, and then start the bidding and the installation phase for the project. Next slide, please. Okay, so we follow, and a lot of other companies will also follow the ASHRAE Standard 211, which is the standard for commercial building energy audits. Anybody who's a CEM or a CEA, they are specifically trained to follow this ASHRAE procedure for energy audits. And this was brought about just to bring some consistency to the industry so that clients know what they can expect whenever they're hiring somebody to perform an energy audit. Another helpful document that we use is it's also from ASHRAE, it's the Procedures for Commercial Building Energy Audits. This contains a lot of it contains forms that you can use on the energy audit itself. It contains a lot of best practices, tips to performing energy audits and structuring that final report so that it's easy to understand for engineers, building operators, stakeholders, what have you. Next slide, please. Okay, so what those standards focus on is, what they focus on a lot is different levels of energy audits. And what I mean by that is that whenever you hire somebody to do an energy audit, there are different levels of detail that you can go into on that audit. And depending on what the goals of the project are, what the client wants, some of these might not be appropriate. So that's why there's 3 different levels. They each escalate in terms of detail. So all of them start with the preliminary energy use analysis. This is basically the utility analysis and benchmarking phases that I mentioned earlier. From there, you can move on to a level 1 energy audit, which is just a really high level look at the building. Typically, after we complete the utility analysis and benchmarking, we'll walk through the building, identify some of the ECMs that can be implemented, and then we'll get rough costs and savings for those. And when I say rough costs, it's typically like $1 per square foot savings, $1 per square foot costs, things like that. After the level 1, the client can choose to move on to a level 2. This is a more detailed analysis of a level 1. So we'll spend a little bit more time in the building doing the survey, doing the study, spend a little bit more time looking at the utility bills. We'll typically develop an end use breakdown of all the utility, of the electric and natural gas usage. So end use meaning like what percentage is used for heating your building, what percentage is used for cooling, refrigeration, things like that. We'll develop more accurate costs and savings for all of the energy conservation measures. This will involve us taking individual specific looks at all of these as opposed to a cost per square foot. And we'll also look at the O&M, the operation and maintenance changes that might be taking place as a result of implementing those measures. Finally, they can choose to move on to a level 3, which is common. You might have heard it called an investment grade audit. This is typically performed if the client is for sure going to act on some of those ECMs. And this will include a further refined analysis of all the ECMs, probably some additional measurements being taken in the building, trends being taken place. And at this phase, an hourly simulation of the building through an energy modeling system can be done if the client wants that as part of the project. So one thing I'll note on this is that an energy audit doesn't have to flow neatly through level 1 all the way up to level 3. It's completely adaptable to what the client wants. Some clients choose to start at a level 2 energy audit. Other clients completely skip the level 2 and go from 1 to 3. So it's really totally customizable based on what the client wants and what the goals of the project are. Next slide. Okay, so I've got a quick example of why starting with energy efficiency is important. So again, if you're above your BEPS target, you're hopefully starting to look at ways that you can reduce your EUI. A really flashy way would be to just install a bunch of solar panels. That's probably not the best route because that's going to end up being really expensive, and I'll show that here in a second. A better way would be to focus on reducing the energy use in your building and then making up the difference with renewable energy. The reason for that is that the cleanest energy that we're ever possibly going to see is the energy that we don't consume. If you never have to turn on the lights in your building, you're better off not doing that as opposed to keeping them on and even powering them with some type of renewable energy. So for this building, first of all, a little disclaimer. We did this energy audit before BEPS was in place, and they also did not look at solar, but we have an idea of costs for the building if they had chose to do solar. So I'm kind of retroactively applying that to make this example. So in the first case, we'll look at solar only. So their BEPS target for their building type would have been 112.3. Their actual building EUI was 125 when we looked at them. So that difference amounts to 1,946,000 kBTUs. If they wanted to just meet all this through solar, they're only looking at the electrical side of things. So they have to make up, they have to generate 570,000 kilowatt hours, which is about a 415 kilowatt array. And the cost of that at $2.50 not a square foot, $2.50 per watt would be $1,037,500. They would get an annual savings of 40,000 thereabouts. So the return on that investment is 3.8%, which is a 26-year payback, which is pretty high. You're even getting up there into the life of the solar panels. So might not be a great strategy to just look at renewables by themselves. So for this client, they actually ended up performing an energy audit. So moving on to the next case right here, we've got an audit plus solar. Oh, not next slide, sorry. To the right here, we've got the next example, an audit plus solar. So the first three lines are the same. They still have that same amount of energy that they need to make up. But since they performed the energy audit first, we identified a number of ECMs that was going to save them 1.9 million kBTUs. So the cost of the audit plus the cost of implementing the energy conservation measures, that ended up being $115,000. This got them close to their BEPS target, but would not have gotten them there. So had they chosen to reduce their energy use further and using the same cost metric as the case before, they would only need to make up 13,000 kilowatt hours now, which is about a 10 kilowatt array. That would cost them an additional $25,000. That brings the total project cost to $140,000 with $30,000 annual savings. Return on that investment is 22%, which is a 4.6-year payback. So really dramatic difference there when you start with the energy efficiency. Next slide. Okay.
John, I just want to jump in and say you've got
Yes.
about 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll do this quick. So we talk a lot about investing in your building. And what we typically mean when we say that is investing so that the occupants are comfortable, they're healthy and productive. You can also invest in energy efficiency. This is investing in your building. And you get the double benefit of improving the occupant comfort when you implement retrocommissioning measures, but you can also save money. I just have this comparison of what an energy audit, what those savings look like compared to investing in like the stock market. So you've got the Dow Jones index. And then I'm comparing that to a pretty conservative 6.5-year simple payback ECM, which is a 15% ROI. So after 10 years, you can see that the ECMs really outperform the stock market, mainly just because you have a consistent payback year after year and you don't have the fluctuations of the market in there. Next slide. Okay, so I will talk just briefly on financing. We've got some people talking about incentives here today, but what they probably will not cover, I just wanted to point out that there is a database, a really great database called the Database of State Incentives for Renewables and Energy Efficiency. I've got their website up there. You can browse to your state and it has all different types of financial incentives by state. I want to specifically call out the Missouri Energy Loan Program. This operates on revolving cycles and offers a really, really low interest loan to people that qualify. That cycle actually just opened up on June 1st and will go until September 30th. So you still have time to apply for this loan. I saw somebody in the chat also mention PACE. That's another good financing mechanism for energy projects. And then last but not least, you've got your utility incentives, Ameren and Spire. And I'll note that we are a qualified RCX provider for both of those. Next slide, please. And lastly, I've just got our service offerings up here. Obviously, energy audits, retrocommissioning. We have dedicated teams to each of those. Energy modeling, we do a lot of that. LEED, we have over 100 buildings certified. Half of them, 60% are gold or higher. And then all the other stuff you see here. So I think that does it for my presentation. Any questions?
John, thanks so much. This is great information. I'll quickly call out that we do have the utilities here today, Ameren and Spire. They're going to be talking about their incentive programs at the end. So thanks for calling that out as an option. And that Rajiv dropped a link to the Missouri revolving loan fund in the chat. If folks are interested in checking that out, I will clarify that it's not available to every building type. Or every building owner type, I guess. Local governments and hospitals and higher ed and K through 12 schools can access that, but it is a really great program, and boy, I'd love to see them expand it to more building types. There's a question for you, John, from Rajiv. He says that the project approach slide is a great visual guide. And he is expecting a surge of work needed from firms like yours to help people comply with BEPS. Do you have any concerns about meeting this demand?
Not really. So typically these can get turned around pretty quickly. I've done some really quick turnaround projects within 3 weeks to a month. That's a pretty quick turnaround, but it can be done. We have a pretty big team at the office that can perform these retrocommissioning studies and energy audits. And also, I mean, we're not the only service provider for these in the area. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that are offering these type of things. So obviously, like, I want to promote myself first of all, but I mean, I can't say that, like, we're the only ones. I think that there are enough people supplying these services that it should not be an issue. So.
Great. Yes, of course, we have lots of great companies in St. Louis that are doing this work. I wonder, just as a follow-up, if there's any concern about the labor market for then the implementation side of things, like if people are going to be, from the contractor side, if that has come up at all.
Yeah, so I can speak more in terms of from the mechanical design side of things, because I also do that with Ross and Baruzzini, mechanical engineer. And I think the bigger concern right now has been just the increase in costs of building materials that we've been hearing a lot about recently. And the only thing I can say to that is that just further emphasizes the importance to get started now, just so that if we get these projects in place, if we know that they're coming, we can better plan for things like, the price of plywood going up 120% or something crazy like that. So it is just important to really get these things scheduled and get moving on this. So.
Other questions for John?
Thanks.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Great job. All right, next up we have, let's see, I'm going to switch the slide. Next up we have Steve Andert, and I lost my notes, and Bethany Beers from Mazzetti. So Steve is an associate principal and senior electrical engineer at Mazzetti. He has 25 years of engineering, project management, and lighting design experience. Fun fact about Steve is that his sister was my high school principal. Bethany is also going to join Steve from Mazzetti. She's a senior associate and energy and commissioning consultant there. So I'm going to let Steve take it away.
Thank you, Emily. You can go to the next slide. So Emily contacted us a couple of weeks ago and posed a question. I think it was more of a challenge. And it was, how would an owner of a hypothetical building bring it into compliance with the new energy policy standards? And we agreed to give it a try. So we have a lot of experience with USGBC from its inception, and we thought it was an exciting thing to do. So hopefully this presentation will give you some ideas on how to assess your needs, how to set a destination or goals, and create a custom plan of energy measures to execute. There's a lot to unpack here, and I want to be conscious of the time frame. So I apologize if I start to read off some of the notes for the slides, but we'll get through it pretty quickly. Next slide, please. First, putting on our owner thinking cap, we wanted to understand what is being asked of us and is it achievable? So we compared the St. Louis targets, which are highlighted there in yellow, with the performance of buildings nationally. And what we found is in most categories, there's a significant margin for future energy savings, even after you meet the current St. Louis standards. As a company, we are also participating in the AIA 2030 Challenge, and we are tracking the EUI for all of our projects. Most of our data is located in hospital and office category, but we do have data in multiple categories. And looking at that, we found that these targets are achievable across all the categories. For this presentation, we decided to look at office buildings. We felt that the challenges there might cross boundaries. The required EUI for offices is 71.7. Next slide, please. In lieu of using a hypothetical building as the basis of our example, we reached out to 2 local office building owners that we believed did not meet the 71.7 EUI. When the first building, Building A, is a large 1980 glass high-rise. Building B is a historic brick and mortar low-rise that is also LEED Silver certified. When we received their 2020 EUI benchmarking data, we were surprised to see that they actually met the current BEPS standard. But we had to stop and think, COVID had a role in that. So the occupancy of the buildings was down, and the building owners prudently modified their building operations to reduce their energy consumption during that period. So we had to go back to 2018 and 2019 to really see how the building performed under normal occupancy. In the end, Building A will need an 8% reduction in energy usage, and Building B will need a 22% reduction in energy usage to achieve the 71.7 EUI under normal operating conditions. Next slide, please. To identify opportunities for energy savings, we need to understand what percentage of the energy in the building is used by the various systems, such as lighting, cooling, heating, and ventilation. These graphs of typical building energy consumption demonstrate how the loads have changed over time. We can see that lighting has become a smaller percentage of the total building energy consumption over time. In the end, you have to decide what your building energy profile is like. If it's more like the one on the left, you need to identify ways to get it to be more like the one on the right. Next slide, please. To identify opportunities for energy savings, we need to understand what percentage of the energy is coming from the different systems. And the best way to get your building energy profile is by performing an on-site energy assessment and an energy model. For this exercise, we really didn't have the time to do that. So we opted to perform interviews with the building owners to identify the pertinent issues. And one of the things you see on there is top concerns. And I think it was very interesting that when we talked with the owners, it wasn't necessarily technical issues that were their top concerns. It was the issues that Cady brought up about leasing agreements and historic impacts that they were most challenged by. But I think that's a topic of another discussion. So next slide, please. Through the interview process, we learned what the driving factors for the current energy savings occurring in the building were and where the opportunities for improvement existed. Building A only needs 8% reduction despite its age. The original 4-pipe system design has the adjustability to efficiently meet occupant comfort and maintain temperatures. While the building's HVAC controls are primarily manual and pneumatic, the operations department is really lucky. They have on staff experienced personnel in these systems who can really manage the operation of these systems well. That's not typically the case in most buildings. The building managers were also proactive at adopting energy efficient LED lighting and office equipment standards to reduce the building connected load. The building has not upgraded the original HVAC equipment to leverage more efficient motors and drives. While the lighting fixtures are efficient, there are still opportunities to optimize lighting controls. The chiller plant optimization has not been performed, and there are opportunities to reduce solar gain more effectively while improving occupant comfort. Next slide, please. Office B is a different situation. Office B needs 22% reduction, but it's already LEED certified. I think this is a good time to remember that LEED is not just about energy efficiency. It's also about the environmental impacts associated with the building and the wellness of the occupants. So opportunities can still exist in a LEED building. This building would benefit from updating its lighting and computer efficiency standards. The current scheduled base lighting controls do not provide the maximum energy savings. Some of the original building energy measures, such as demand side ventilation, have been disabled, and the building does not have any energy recovery capabilities currently. Next slide, please. Based on what we learned from these interviews, we estimated an energy profile for each building. You can see Office A uses significantly more energy than Office B because it's a much larger building. But we also identified that lighting made up a much larger percentage of the current Office B energy consumption. Next slide, please. This slide shows the ECMs we considered for each building and what percentage reduction could potentially be achieved. In the absence of performing a true energy model, we utilized our project experience and industry studies to identify what percentage we felt we could reduce the existing energy consumption. Office Building A has the potential of a 30% reduction, significantly larger than it needs to meet the ordinance. The largest cumulative energy saving in Building A will be HVAC driven. HVAC equipment optimization and lighting controls bring the added benefit of deferred maintenance costs and the potential for utility incentives. Office Building B's simpler HVAC system doesn't really lend itself to significant energy savings without some major modifications to the system. However, it would still benefit from upgrading variable frequency drives and motor efficiencies, as well as the potential of installing a heat reclaim system. Most of the savings for Office Building B are going to come from upgrading lighting efficiencies, lighting controls, and office equipment efficiencies. But in order to meet the 22% reduction needed, there's still going to have to be some energy savings gained from the HVAC system in Office Building B. Next slide, please. So we've kind of highlighted a few ECMs in that list, and I'm going to let Bethany talk about some HVAC ECMs for each building.
So on the list, you saw that the chiller plant optimization was one that we highlighted for office building A, because really that's a great opportunity for the system. There's 4 chillers that they manually stage on and optimize, to use the word, during different times of the year and different peaks throughout, especially the summer and hot seasons. But with some controls implemented on that, we could automate that system, and we could make sure that those chillers are running at their peak efficiency, their peak where they land on the efficiency curve at all times. Even though they're not variable speed chillers themselves, we can still review where those curves are and figure out, okay, what's the best point to bring those chillers on and maintain them at that peak efficiency. Because if the graph in the lower left-hand corner there with the chiller plant energy use spectrum, we want to be much farther on that left side in order to really maximize the efficiency of those chillers. And when you have a building with a chiller plant in it, you can see kind of the breakdown of, if you look at your chiller plant energy use, your chillers obviously are your biggest pieces of equipment and they use the most energy. Then when you kind of take the chunk of that pie and put it into the total HVAC use, it's about 1/3 of that overall load typically. And when you look at your total building use, your HVAC is about 1/3 to 30 to 40% of your total HVAC load. So you can, it is a big chunk of energy that you can address and see a lot of gains, and even potentially gains in occupant comfort as well. We'll go to the next one. And then for office building B, one of the recommended measures was heat recovery. And so implementing some sort of airstream heat recovery. These are what we've kind of shown here is an energy wheel system. So there's a retrofit application where you can essentially, they're hard to insert into an existing unit, but there's some different ductwork configurations and things that we could make work, but that allows us to, in the winter, recapture heat, and in the summer, recapture cooling. And so preheat that incoming outside air, pre-cool that incoming outside air. We can manage humidity a little bit better as well, which also helps your DX systems work more efficiently. So lots of opportunities there, and without doing an actual energy model or detailed energy calcs, which we just didn't have time to see exactly what those savings would be. But we've done these ECMs on projects in the past and are relying on a 30-minute phone call with each of these owners and quick brainstorming of all the opportunities, and these are the ones that immediately became obvious as, oh, this is a way we know we can start chipping away at the goals that we need to hit for reduction.
And just to expand on Bethany's comment there, the existing system in building B, we really didn't want to get into changing all the ductwork in the building or having to make major modifications on the distribution. So what we were considering here is really adding a dedicated outside air unit to take that outside air load out of the existing air handling units, create its own unit where we can optimize it, and then be able to install that heat reclaim in that unit. Mm-hmm. So we could try to reduce that construction cost and construction impact. Next slide, please. So if you looked really quick and really hard at our list of ECMs, you might have noticed that in building B, which is the older building, we were identifying up to 17% energy savings, total building energy savings with lighting. And the question is, how can you do that? So, and it really comes down to the fact that LED lighting, since they are primarily fluorescent there, LED lighting can get us a 30 to 50% energy reduction simply by switching to that light source. And there are cost-effective ways to retrofit existing light fixtures with LEDs, but there are also benefits to just simply replacing light fixtures with new LED lighting and designing the light levels to an appropriate light level. So a significant cost savings just by switching to LED. Next slide, please. on top of that, so if we get a 50% reduction in our lighting, connected lighting load, we can continue to get energy savings with lighting controls. And though the building B does not have motion sensors throughout its facility, just installing motion sensors on its own isn't where we stop getting energy savings. If we start to control how those motion sensors control those lights, in lieu of just automatically coming on to full when you walk in the space, the light fixtures could come on to 50% and then require some human intervention to bring them up to 100%. That can save another 52%. And on several of our projects, we have access to the lighting control systems after installation. And we've gone in and we've looked at what the lighting usage really is. And with all the control measures and the efficient product offerings, we can see that the actual lighting energy consumption can be as low as 10% of the connected lighting load. So lighting is a great way to address some of your energy needs. Next slide. And now we'll open it for questions. Hope that wasn't too fast.
Steve and Bethany, thank you. I think that was a great, I think you met my challenge, I guess is what I'm trying to say, of taking this hypothetical building. I'm hoping that your building owners are here because Maddie's going to talk about the lighting incentives that Ameren has right now, and I think you'll find that they're very rich and there's a good opportunity to be taken advantage of. But anyone have any questions for Steve or Bethany? Everyone's so quiet. I guess I will ask a question more about those top concerns that you mentioned, Steve. I don't know if you can, I mean, I find it interesting that the top concerns really weren't about so much the systems and the energy use, but other kind of more human things in the building. Is that a good assessment of what you heard?
Yes, and it really came down to, they know that they have ways to save energy. They know that there's options out there, but how are they going to implement them? And some of the stumbling blocks that they saw to implementing them are lease agreements with their current tenants. They've already promised them that they can have services during certain hours. They've have not instigated possibly restrictions on what kind of lighting products or lighting efficiency they have to use. So how do they go back to those tenants and instigate those things? But what's the real cycle of turnover in their building that they can start to incorporate these energy upgrades? In addition, some of the historic buildings may have restrictions on additional rooftop equipment, whereas we were talking about adding a DOAS on top of that existing building. The question is, will it meet the historic limitations? What other modifications could we make to the building envelope and still comply with the historic limitations? So how is the city going to balance its current regulations in areas like historic requirements with this new energy policy standard? And the last one was really just motivating the board of each building to invest in their buildings. And so some of these items are going to have simple paybacks, but the larger energy savings are probably going to require ROIs similar to what John had identified. You know, a 21% ROI is a 5-year payback. So they have to make that kind of investment in their building. I think actually that the standard, having a standard, a BEPS standard, is going to help incentivize them to make those changes. Because there will be ramifications if they don't. I also believe that some of the Ameren incentives that we're going to be talking about will help in that regard too.
And I think to add on to that, a key point is the one that Rajiv made about, you know, buildings that are way above where they need to be. But if they can show 50% improvement within that compliance period, that gives owners flexibility when they have, you know, those big capital measures like building A, like, okay, the boiler needs to be replaced, chillers need to be replaced, they're at end of life in coming years, but maybe it's a year or two outside of that compliance path. So compliance requirements. So can we get to the 50% and then master plan the end of life replacement of that equipment? And then what incentives can we fold in to then not just do a like for like, you know, just pull a chiller, put in a new chiller, but let's look at a new system combination, you know, heat recovery chillers that can provide a, you know, 80 to 90% of our building heating load and maintain our base cooling load at all times. You know, what are those new efficient technologies that are out there? And it gives them some flexibility to get there over time, especially when you're rubbing up against that. Well, we're not there, but the only way to get there is capital projects, but we're not, it's not in the cards yet, right? So I really thought that was a good point and a good strategy that gives owners some flexibility.
Emily, do we have just one more minute?
Sure, yeah.
So on building A, when we looked at our ECM list, you really probably could take the save before you spend approach and get that 8%. So the top of that list is turning things off and turning things down. And you could probably get 8% out of the building that way. But because the building systems are original, there's really the opportunity to combine this energy incentive with deferring maintenance costs and taking advantage of incentives. So I think that if I were building A, I would want to look at those longer term payback items and see how I could leverage those to my best financial picture.
Right. That's a really good point too, when it gets to this idea that Rajiv mentioned of like, oh, Rajiv, remind me what you're calling that. Like if you're exceeding if you exceed the standard, if you do better than the standard by a certain amount in the first compliance cycle, that could allow you
to be in compliance for multiple cycles. Yeah.
Right,
now,
right.
The
So
working
this
title is rewarding early adopters.
Yeah. So it seems like this particular building, Office A, Steve, that you were talking about, has that opportunity to maybe consider going beyond the performance standard because they have so much to gain in the system replacements that have not been touched since the building was built. Is that
correct?
Yeah. So they could really jump ahead and then potentially be in compliance for a future cycle. And that's one of the things, you know, that I think the Building Energy Improvement Board that the city has overseeing this, they want to encourage that, right? So it's interesting. I think this is an interesting scenario to present.
Thanks. I just want to make one quick comment because I know we still have the utilities. What Bethany, Steve, and you just touched upon is really the heart of the ordinance. It's about that continuous. It's about that continuous improvement, but also getting building owners, as you work with your clients, getting them to understand that it's not about just getting these buildings into compliance each cycle. It's about getting them to invest in their buildings for that for those savings and for that longer term compliance. If they can do these things to meet the standard, that's great. But if they can go beyond, that allows them to be in compliance for multiple cycles. That's a message that has to be reiterated to these building owners.
And Rajiv, we might want to clarify, we did not include renewable energy sources as a potential way to reduce the EUI because we're under the impression that that doesn't really meet the current BEPS standard.
That is correct.
And it's just our philosophy to conserve first before doing anything beyond that. And just to touch on, you know, the leases, we've done some net zero lease projects, you know, so they're a net zero building, but then each lease is structured as net zero within the building as well. And so you can kind of gamify. There's some fun ways to do that now where you're sort of pitting your tenants against each other. And, you know, are they performing within their energy budget, and how are their versus their neighbors. And so there's new ways that as leases turn over to restructure the language and start making those incremental moves towards long-term change within those agreements.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, if there's anything out there. All right, well, we'll move on to the next thing. I love the idea of net zero leases. So Bethany, I may follow up with you on that one. I know that leases are going to be a big issue, and it sounds like that's something we want to explore in the future in terms of maybe the next carousel that we have scheduled later this year. So our next presenter is Maddie Emerson, and Maddie is an energy efficiency outreach specialist for Ameren, Missouri's BizSavers program. And a fun fact about Maddie is that she and I went to the same high school, that same high school where Steve's sister was principal. And she was also an intern with USGBC years ago. So Maddie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, as Emily said, I do customer outreach for the Ameren BizSavers program, which I hope, and I'm glad to hear that others agree, should be a great resource to support you all in getting to compliance with the BEPS. Next slide, please. So today, for those who may not be as familiar with the BizSavers program, I'll start with a bit of background. We offer cash incentives to customers to help offset the upfront cost of energy efficient equipment upgrades. Most commonly, that's, as we've mentioned, LED lighting or high efficiency HVAC units. But as I'll get into, there's a lot more to take advantage of than that. And the program is open to businesses, so commercial and industrial electric customers of Ameren, Missouri. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot of the projects that completed last year, which was, as we know, a tough year for a lot of businesses. We definitely saw a considerable dip in the work that was going on, but we still paid out just over $15 million in incentives to customers. Next slide, please. So to jump in with a broad look at the set of programs that fall under the BizSavers umbrella, these first three, standard, custom, and retrocommissioning, are the ones that we'll cover today. The three at the bottom here, I will not be covering in detail, but I just wanted to briefly mention first that we do offer incentives for designing new buildings or new additions more efficiently than what is required by your local code. We also offer incentives to help cover the cost of sending your facilities personnel to training for a building operator certification. And finally, I know you're all here because you have large facilities, but if you have small general service sites as well, we offer enhanced incentives, incentive rates, and a simpler hands-off process for basic lighting and HVAC upgrades at those smaller facilities. So let's quickly dig into those first three, starting with the standard program on the next slide. Our standard program is exactly what that little icon looks like. It's basically a checklist that describes a piece of equipment. And if the equipment that you purchase meets that description on the list, then you get an established incentive rate, like $8 for an LED tube or $150 for a smart thermostat. You'll notice various technology types here. It's really an ever-expanding list of different common equipment, not only those LED lamps and fixtures, but also high efficiency HVAC units, variable frequency drives, smart thermostats, Energy Star commercial kitchen equipment, etc. So the key takeaways here are that no pre-approval is required for these items. Although, as you'll see at the bottom, sometimes you can get more money if you do submit ahead of time, but it's not required. You can purchase and install and then apply. So anything on this list that you've purchased for your facilities since March of 2019, when this program cycle started, could still be eligible for an incentive through our standard program. And this full detailed list that's pictured here can be found on our website. And as I alluded, there is a note here about a special promotion we're running for certain lighting projects submitted by July 31st and complete before the end of this year. I have a hard time believing that the rates for those kinds of projects will ever be higher than they are this summer. So it's a great time to make moves if you can. And if you're considering an equipment upgrade or any kind of energy saving project that you don't see on that list, that doesn't mean that we don't offer an incentive for it. Next slide, please. It just means that you would have to go through our custom program. So unlike our standard program, custom incentives must be submitted for pre-approval before anything is purchased or installed. We need to look at the proposal, work with you or your contractor on some kind of calculation of expected energy savings, and then provide you with an incentive offer before you start the work. If you're considering upgrades to any of these equipment types, like more specialized HVAC equipment, compressed air systems, motors, process equipment for industrial facilities, don't hesitate to reach out. 7 cents doesn't look like a lot, but upgrading process equipment controls at a large industrial facility can result in an incentive in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, again, depending on the energy savings. Next slide, please. And the last of our programs for today, but certainly not the least, I wanted to end on retro-commissioning, which I think, and I hope John would agree, is far and away the best program offering for most facilities that are over 100,000 square feet, especially those with existing energy management systems. You work with an approved service provider to do a study of your building's performance and identify low-cost improvements with paybacks under 1.5 years. And then our program will generally cover a very significant portion of the study and implementation costs, depending on the energy savings. This is applied not only in the sense that John described, but also for leak detection of compressed air systems for industrial customers. So if you're interested, definitely check this out on our website or reach out to us about it. And with that overview of efficiency opportunities and our incentives available to help cover the cost, I just wanted to quickly highlight some additional program resources. The next slide. So in addition to that other special lighting offer that I mentioned before, we're currently running a 10 to 15% bonus incentive beyond the rates listed on all of those brochures for all custom and standard interior lighting and HVAC projects. So either until the end of this year or until that bonus budget runs out, which you can track on our website. And next slide, please. Speaking of that website, in addition to all of our program offerings, guidelines, applications, you can find case studies there from our other customers, or you can post a job to our bid board to have vendors and contractors reach out to you. There are a lot of resources available here. Next slide. And if you'd rather start by talking to someone on my team directly, we can help you identify opportunities, get in touch with contractors and vendors, help with the application process. So as I'm sure I've said a couple of times today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. It's not just Rob and Rick pictured there. There's a whole team of us. They're just in charge. So next slide, please. I can leave these key takeaways up for you all and just let me know if you have any questions.
Great. Thank you, Maddie. There is a question in the chat about when the limited time incentive bonus launched.
That was last July, I believe. July 7th comes to mind, but I might be making that up. So yeah, if we can go back to the slide with that, you can tell it's been running for almost a year now, and it's about a little over halfway gone. So we've seen like a significant uptick in the projects coming in with, moving out of COVID times, hopefully. So it's going a little faster now, but that's how much we have currently.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our final presenter, if that's okay, and we'll hold the utility questions till the very end. Maddie, thanks so much. Our next presenter is Chris Wright, and he is an energy efficiency specialist with Spire. Chris has been with Spire for 20 years and has worked in many roles, from the mailroom to the to running the quality assurance in the call center. So we're glad he's landed on energy efficiency. And I'll just share a fun fact about Chris is that he's featured in the Earthways Center Green Living Festival in one of the workshops. Spire is a workshop sponsor. Ameren is a festival presenting sponsor, and that is going on through today. So you can check that out. I'm going to ask Freddie to drop a link in the chat to where you can learn more about the Green Living Festival. So Chris, turn it over to you to take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And I'll also be part of the live chat after this for that booth for the Green Living. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop in on that as well.
Right.
But yeah, I just wanted to talk about a few of our incentives, what we offer as far as our energy efficiency program. You can go ahead and go to the next slide there. I just wanted to have our mission up on the screen when we started. Anytime I give these presentations, I do want to at least throw out what we offer residentially, because we are all residential customers at the end of the day. So if anybody can take advantage of any of these, but we offer safe, reliable comfort and energy savings. So whether it's a new home, remodeling, saving on gas bills, we have rebates that make it easier to save on upgrades. So as you see there, those are just some residential rebates. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but from gas tankless and storage water heaters to programmable thermostats to the high efficiency furnaces and boilers. Those are available to everyone. They're on our website. Or if you have any questions, my information will be at the end of this slide. You can contact me on that. We can go ahead and go to the next slide there. What is part more for today, and what we're discussing is our commercial and industrial rebate program overviews. Standard, similar to Ameren, we have that checklist of a pre-qualified equipment and services with fixed rebate amounts. I won't go into too much detail on that because there are too many to list. If you do have questions, I really would appreciate anyone reaching out to me that has any type of question or would like any additional information on that. Similar to Ameren, we do have our custom projects, which are projects that feature energy savings, gas equipment, or technologies that just aren't included in that checklist of standard rebates. We integrated facility projects resulting in gas savings, such as building shell improvements, extensive renovations, and pre-approval is necessary to determine this rebate commitment. So we have a group of engineers that factor those gas savings, and then we base the rebate upon that information. So one of the things that was talked about earlier were the chillers and the heat returns on that. This is something that we could consider a custom rebate once we can calculate what type of total savings we're looking at. Things simply as so simple as insulation in a building, pipe wrap, things of that nature. Anything you're doing to your building or that's going to create any type of gas savings, let us know before you do it, and we can look to see if that may be something we can get you a rebate on. We work with a lot of large schools. We worked with the airport, just trying to figure out what we can do to help with energy efficiency and with the incentives that we can provide to help with that process. The energy audits, we have rebates up to 75% of the audit cost. That's for customers who implement a standard rebate or a custom rebate project. So if you get the audit performed, you have to implement at least one thing that was provided in that audit to qualify for the energy audit rebate. And as you see at the link down below, spireenergy.com at commercial rebates, all of this information for our residential and custom rebates are available on there. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is something I just wanted to throw out as well when I give these presentations, is I want everyone to know, and especially in the St. Louis area, that we co-deliver with Ameren on different programs, low-income programs. So we have our Community Savers multifamily, single family, and then we have our school kits. You can go ahead and go to the next slide and I'll discuss in a little more detail. But so one of these really help with energy efficiency. When we're talking, we do the single family, which is just one home at a time, but we also do multifamily projects with Ameren. So we're talking, maybe 50 to 100 unit buildings where we're doing furnace cleaning checks, low flow shower heads, things of that nature. But we've also added actual gas furnace replacement, gas boiler replacement, storage and tankless water heater replacements. So these are available to our customers. Also we have the school kits, which is just more of providing this information to our local schools so they can get this information out to the community. So these are also a big part of our energy efficiency measures that we're trying to get out. So if you're in this position, or maybe a building owner in this position, please reach out and contact us so we can get you some information on that. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Emily. And here's my information. So Christopher Wright, Energy Efficiency Representative. There's my cell phone number, my email address. I know this is recorded, and I'm not sure if we're going to get the final product out to everyone as far as the slides, but if you have any questions at all, please reach out to me and I can get you any additional information that you may need.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. I am gonna stop sharing my screen and we can take questions for Maddie and Chris or any of the other presenters. We have a few minutes before we need to wrap up. Thanks everyone for sticking with us, and thanks to all of our presenters today. This was really great, appreciate it. Anyone want to ask some questions? We had Maddie answered a few in the chat, so it's good info there. All right, so let's see. Heather is asking whether there were additional funds allocated for 2022, or does it just extend the use of the current allocation? I think this is a question for Maddie.
Yes, good question. And so to recap for the group, these Ameren incentive programs run in 3-year cycles that are approved by the state, and that's been the case since 2009. So there's always a mechanism, or there has always historically been a mechanism at the transition of cycles to kind of help support customers through that transition into the next program cycle. It's kind of a little bit different this year. So rather than starting a new 3-year cycle in 2022, there's a 1-year extension of the current program through 2022. There was a new budget and energy savings target set for the year of 2022. So those energy savings targets and the budget are comparable to the years of the existing cycle. So we can expect that in most incentive rates will be fairly comparable, but those details on the programs to be offered and the incentive rates have not been entirely hammered out yet. We'll definitely make that information available as soon as possible when they are. I hope that answers the question, but feel free to follow up with me afterwards.
Great, thanks, Maddie. Other questions? Jump in. Well, I have a question. It's not actually for the panelists, but maybe for our attendees. Are there topics that we should be covering in upcoming trainings, that build upon what we've talked about today, or things that we haven't covered, like maybe the question of leasing, or things that people would like to see? And then a question for our panelists, actually, if it's okay for me to distribute your slides.
Totally fine with me. And the only thing I will add is, so we've got a draft copy right now of the compliance pathways that the city has developed. I'm happy to actually share that to gain feedback, just because it'll help us inform how we should change or what additional considerations we should take into factor for finalizing those. So I'll send that to you, Emily, so you can put it in your compiled email for folks. And for anyone who has, for the folks who have more questions about BEPS for the city, just send it my way, please.
Everyone's so quiet in the morning. I will give one more plug for the Green Living Festival. So today is the last day of that festival, but we had Energy Efficiency Day on Wednesday, and we had a really, really fantastic panel of focusing on healthy homes and energy efficiency with the County Department of Health and Castle and a homeowner from Habitat for Humanity talking about how moving into a green and healthy home really changed her life. And so I would encourage people to take a look at those recorded sessions. But then today, as Chris mentioned, starting at 10:30 is a live exhibitor hall, but it really just on Zoom, right? So, so he's going to be hosting Spire's booth. I know someone will be hosting from Ameren. Obviously, these are more focused on residential things, but Freddie and I will be on for USGBC. There's lots of fun vendors that you could talk to between 30 and noon today. So kind of a fun way to follow up after this.
I guess I had a question for Rajiv. So this is adopted St. Louis City. Have there been discussions with St. Louis County? Is there anything in the works there?
Well, I'll be honest, Steve. So I myself have not had those conversations. I know that various groups like Emily and the USGBC have been campaigning for the county to do some type of benchmarking policy, or at least at the very minimum benchmark county buildings. But as of right now, I've not had conversations on the county passing similar legislation. One thing I will say though is the building energy exchange that the USGBC is launching this year is meant to serve as a regional building hub. So not just building owners in the city of St. Louis.
Great.
That's my not so secret pipe dream, is to get this going in St. Louis County. There's a lot more challenges because of the municipalities and how would it be implemented, and you know, that just a lot more challenges there.
Yeah, just that fragmented governance is definitely an obstacle. But I mean, I'm hopeful that the county can at least do benchmarking within the next couple of years, but we'll see. I'm just laser focused on the city stuff.
Let's see. All right. Well, we're 1 minute away from 10 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and call it. I will definitely send out the slides from this presentation. I may have to load them up onto like Google Drive or something, because it's a real big file. And then we'll also share the information that Rajiv mentioned about the compliance pathways that the city has drafted, so that folks can provide feedback for us. But I do want to thank one more time our presenters, Rajiv, Cady, John, Steve, Bethany, Maddie, and Chris. This is a really great lineup. We did record it, and I'll figure out where we can probably upload that to YouTube as well. So feel free to be in touch if you have questions about anything we talked about today, and if you have suggestions for future sessions. And with that, I'll wish everyone a happy Friday. So thanks for joining us.
Bye, everybody.
Happy Friday. Thanks, Emily.
It's National Donut Day, so go get a donut.
Yes.